Welcome back to another exciting tutorial on the wonderful world of art and stuff. Today we're going to be talking about perspective. Perspective is arguably one of the most complex fundamentals out there. However, it's also, in my opinion, one of the easiest to fake. So perspective is the idea of creating a three-dimensional space, but on a two-dimensional plane, aka the canvas. Perspective is an illusion, really, if you think of it like that. You're trying to make something feel like it is in this three-dimensional space, even though it could never realistically be that way when we are viewing something two-dimensionally. The way this is done is through various techniques and methods that have been mastered over the last few centuries. And in all honesty, I don't believe the exact measurements are always necessary for creating a passable three-dimensional space. Like I mentioned previously, perspective is one of the fundamentals that I think can be fudged or faked the most and still look pretty acceptable. As long as you know the very basics of the fundamental, you can fake your way all the way to the top. I know many artists who work professionally that really don't know much about perspective, and although they usually don't need to and their work still looks great, sometimes you'll get a commission that unveils all of that stuff you don't actually know and you're kind of screwed. I think it's better to be prepared than to be commissioned to do something you aren't ready to do and give the client a bad image. Not only that, but working on perspective and every other fundamental actually will only help boost your art skills. It will unlock a whole new perspective, you could say. But seriously, where previously you may view things two-dimensionally and maybe have some slight knowledge of how to make something look foreshortened, once you practice perspective, you'll be able to view things three-dimensionally and be more confident in how you would place things in an image if there's heavy emphasis on perspective in it. This tutorial will cover the basics of perspective, though. I personally don't think I'm in a knowledgeable enough position to go into too much detail on the very specific features or tips and tricks of perspective drawing. However, if you are interested in further research on this stuff, I highly recommend looking into Scott Robertson's How to Draw book or checking out some of Modern Day James's videos on his YouTube channel for free. Both are great sources for learning more on this subject. What I plan on teaching you today, though, is every aspect of perspective that I think is the bare minimum to know in order to get major commercial work. I'll also discuss a few helpful tricks that will come in handy when needing to draw any scene that will require precise perspective. Before we jump into all of this sweet, fat, juicy knowledge, though, I do want to discuss something that I'm sure many of you may be thinking about when learning this portion of the fundamentals. The rise of new programs, or cheats, as some stubborn, crabby people might see them as, is definitely something to consider when discussing this side of the fundamentals. Yes, there are many programs that can be used to not only establish a perspective grid, but also create buildings and people and lighting, etc. Why should you bother learning this stuff when some of these programs do it all for you? Honestly, the best answer I have is that you should know it so that you can save your own ass in the future. I've met a lot of artists over the years, and many of them have used programs like Modo, 3D Coat, ZBrush, Daz, etc., all with the purpose of speeding up their process or to make a more accurate interpretation of their concept. And it's only going to grow more and more prevalent as time goes on. I kind of have a story for this. So I just recently participated in a workshop that had a lot of students from a digital art school participate. When I got to chat with some of these students, I asked them what all they were learning in their classes because I was curious. The students all told me very confidently that they were learning this brand new program and it's becoming the industry standard, and they swore by it. They sounded so confident with this statement that when I told them I didn't know any of those programs and I've never needed to, they didn't really seem to know what to say to that. I've met many working professionals that have worked on major titles who rely on these programs for all of their perspective knowledge, and unfortunately it can show in the work. Sometimes it doesn't, and a lot of the times it does. A lot of the times, these artists will have a perspective that more than likely started accurately, but once characters or props were added into the scene, they didn't know how to seamlessly add them in without kind of butchering the perspective. It happens all the time. But that's also why I said perspective can be fudged, because although I've seen images like that for major titles, they still were images that were accepted, and the artist was still paid and hired back for more projects. Not because the client couldn't tell the perspective was off, but more than likely it's just because the image was good enough for what the image was meant for. But the reason I encourage everyone, no matter what additional programs you may use in your process, to learn the fundamentals is because at some point you won't know why something looks wrong, and therefore you won't know how to fix it. And although you may still get paid, you may still get hired again, your work won't be as good as it can be, and that will just eat away at your soul like nobody's business. All this being said, it's fine if you use additional programs. I've personally used SketchUp many times in the past to quickly get a layout of the perspective for an image. However, I've also been that guy that noticed something was off and wasn't sure how to fix it. So trust me when I tell you it's important to learn how to do this stuff on your own without the help from other programs. So with all that being said, let's learn some perspective terms. Foreshortening. Foreshortening was briefly discussed in the anatomy video, so I'm sorry if you've already watched that and may have heard my spiel on all of this. I think this is an important basic to perspective though, so in case anyone skipped directly to this video, I thought it would be best to include it. Foreshortening is the idea of objects being placed in a way that causes our eyes to perceive them as either closer or farther in view. This can be done with a simple method that some people call the T method. You're basically attempting to create the illusion of space between objects by having the outer contour lines of an object intersect with another's. By doing so, you create this T shape. It's a very easy thing to start applying to your work, but it can be difficult to keep in mind, especially since although it is a method for creating that illusion of three-dimensional space, it isn't really having a grasp of the object being three-dimensional. In the examples I've been giving, all the objects have been flat shapes that don't take up any type of a realistic area, but the T-shape intersections still trick your brain into thinking one is in front of the other, regardless of the fact that they are clearly two-dimensional and that they're flat. I used to think that foreshortening was one of the more difficult parts of perspective, and it is difficult to capture at first, but it's more of a simple trick to keep in mind when trying to give the illusion of perspective. The really tough thing with perspective is training your brain to think of forms in a three-dimensional way within a three-dimensional space. And that will come with study and practice of the different portions we'll be discussing later on in the video. Before I move on though, I'm going to give another couple examples of how to help you wrap your brain around 3D objects. These are things that I'm borrowing from the anatomy tutorial, so I'm sorry if you've already heard this. There are some simple exercises to try out that can help your brain warm up to the idea of drawing objects in a fake three-dimensional space. One exercise that I recommend people try is just taking basic objects like cubes, cylinders, spheres, etc., and drawing them in various angles from your imagination. Consider these two basic rules of perspective when working on this. The further something gets in view, the smaller it appears. I'm not just referring to a guy standing at the end of the street versus someone standing in front of you. Clearly, the person in front of you will appear larger and the person at the end of the street will appear smaller. I'm also referring to the small forms and planes that you may not notice immediately. For instance, when viewing a cylinder perfectly straight on, both ends appear to be the same size. The minute it is tilted slightly though, the end that is closest to your eyes will appear larger while the other end shrinks slightly. This effect is obviously much greater the further the object moves backwards or forwards in space. The second rule is how planes change when an object changes angles. Let's use the cylinder example once more, except this time the cylinder will start with the base of it facing directly towards us, almost like it was knocked over on a table. This plane is completely flat to us and we can view it fully. However, the minute the cylinder begins tilting upwards, we can see the plane begin to shrink. In the anatomy video, we discussed these exercises in a way that was meant for the human body, but in this video, we will actually be talking about why objects appear smaller when farther away and larger when closer. And we will talk about what exactly is happening in perspective when an object is tilting, like in the second exercise. But for now, feel free to noodle around with these two ideas while I ramble on about whatever. Horizon line. Perspective, unlike many of the other fundamentals, actually has this kind of solid technique or layout that you are encouraged to follow in order to help your scene feel like it's in a realistic space. This layout includes a lot of different terms. The first one is the horizon line. We'll also be discussing vanishing points, line of sight, cone of vision, and the perspective grid. To start us off, the horizon line, as you probably could have guessed by now, is where the end of the horizon is. It's a horizontal line that represents where the eye can't see past. Occasionally, it can even be curved if you are high enough to see the curvature of the Earth. The horizon line placement is crucial to getting an accurate representation of the three-dimensional space you want to create or emulate. The placement of the horizon line when being viewed in a 2D plane can change and even be moved off of the page depending on the angle of the line of sight. Typically though, the horizon line is within the picture and will act as a guide for the majority of your measuring, so make sure that it's accurate. An easy way to create a perfectly horizontal line if you are using Photoshop is to hold Shift while using the brush tool. This will lock in the brush to either maintain a perfect horizontal or vertical stroke, depending on what direction you begin painting. Trust me, if you don't do this already, you gotta start doing this when you're gonna be practicing perspective. It's kind of a big deal. Line of sight. The line of sight is the angle and height that the viewer or camera is observing the scene from. The line of sight can change the placement of the horizon line on your image. Imagine looking directly out into the ocean. Maybe you're focusing on like a distant ship or something. Think about your height and at what angle you are looking out at the ocean. Now imagine you shift your gaze upwards because you notice a stupid seagull or something, or an alien. We'll go with an alien ship, sure, keeping it classy. If we were to continue your gaze within a frame, as all images are, when you shifted your line of sight upwards, the horizon line has now dropped out of the frame of the scene. It's still there, it's still good to establish so that we know how much the objects in our scene will grow or recede into space, but it isn't actually within the scene anymore. The same effect would happen if we tilted our head downwards and stared at the ground below us. We can no longer see the horizon line, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Station point. The station point is the point at which the viewer is positioned when viewing the scene or object. If we look back at our lovely alien-ridden beach scene, we can see that we are standing just near the edge of the ocean. However, if we were to step back a ways, this would become our new station point. Our line of sight hasn't changed. We're still looking out parallel to the ground plane that we're on. Just our physical position has changed. The same can be said if we were to stand on top of a box, a mysterious box washed ashore. Once we stand on the mystery box, we can see our height has risen slightly. Standing higher or lower will affect the height of the horizon line, and therefore will affect the way we perceive objects, since every object changes depending on our relation to the horizon line. Many of these terms, they might seem redundant at the moment, but they're going to become more important later on. Vanishing point. A vanishing point is wherever parallel lines converge in perspective. These parallel lines will converge somewhere along the horizon line. Wherever that convergence lies creates a vanishing point. And any other object parallel to that object in perspective, whether it be horizontally parallel or vertically parallel, as long as it maintains that same angle that the initial object is placed in, it will follow the same pattern of parallel lines that will lead to that vanishing point. There's always what is called the center vanishing point. This vanishing point is wherever the viewer's line of sight resides. When objects follow the center vanishing point, anything on the left side will lean to the left, exposing more of the right side planes, and the same logic goes for the right side of the vanishing point as well. If we were to use that same method vertically, we would be following the split of the horizon line. Anything above the horizon line will expose the underside of an object. Anything below the horizon line will expose the top planes of an object. So let's go back to the ocean example. We'll say that your line of sight is straight ahead, creating a parallel line between your line of sight and the ground. And let's say that those aliens from before have brought friends, and all of them have cubes for ships. I'm going to draw cubes, okay? I'm looking for an excuse to draw cubes. Just go with it, whatever. So if we were to base these cubes on this center vanishing point, that would mean that at least two of the sides receding into space would be parallel to one another and follow a path leading towards the center vanishing point. And any other shape that is at the same angle or is parallel to this cube will also converge on the same point. Vanishing points will be repeatedly used when we move on to discussing the different types of perspective layouts. They are essential for keeping a consistent structure to your image and the perspective being established in it. Cone of vision. Cone of vision is the area that our eyes can see when we remove our peripheral vision. Following along a cone of vision is what stops our objects from becoming distorted when reaching the far ends of a perspective grid. Some of you who've already experimented with perspective may have encountered this before, where you're establishing your basic layout of what will be in your scene, but near the edges of the image, your structure begins to elongate or stretch more than you would like. This generally happens because you've broken that cone of vision. It isn't necessarily inaccurate to have that stretching occur. However, the distortion can cause some strange effects. I never say you shouldn't experiment though. I'm sure you could get some very interesting effects by embracing that distortion. Cone of visions are also great for measuring angles of vanishing points, which will be helpful later on. I do want to mention though that cones of vision is getting a little bit more into the advanced spectrum. I do think it's important in order to get an accurate perspective layout for your image, but I am going to gloss over some of the specifics of cone of vision and instead just sort of generally state that the further out you get from the center of your image, the more distortion you will have. If you want to look more into cone of vision, I do recommend, like I said previously, Scott Robertson's How to Draw book, or Modern Day James, I'm sure, has a video on it somewhere. He's got tons. The only reason I'm going to gloss over this, though, is just that I want to maintain the fact that this is meant to be a beginner's guide to the fundamental. And I do think, and I feel that cones of vision starts to get a little bit more into the advanced side. But I thought it was important to mention, so when you start seeing your image get weird and distorted, this is why. It's the cone of vision. Perspective grid. A perspective grid is a series of parallel lines organized in such a way that they can be used as a guideline for you to follow along for your own structures. These lines don't immediately read as parallel, but they are parallel within the perspective that you're constructing. So although yes, they are all shrinking in on a point, whether that's in or out of the image, they represent parallel lines within your mock-up of a 3D space. If you're going to base the majority of your image in two-point perspective with the same vanishing points, you'll want a guide for you to follow so that every object is being placed accurately within 3D space. We'll go into how to construct these grids easily later on in the video, but for now, all you have to know is that these will be your guides once you've found and established your vanishing points, your horizon line, and your cone of vision. All right, so not too many terms to keep track of for now. The next step that we're going to take is to apply all of these terms into practice so you can better understand them. I really recommend that you follow along in this next part though, because too many people will just watch tutorials and you won't actually follow along with the process. I get it. I understand if you're watching this in a time or place that you can't draw or follow along in Photoshop, but please, I mean, seriously, take the time to draw these out on your own. It took me years to learn perspective because I wouldn't follow along and instead pretended to know what I was doing by looking at how other people started perspective drawings or grids. It's a lot more complex than just constructing a grid of lines to follow. One-point perspective. I'll go through the process of creating an image using a one-point perspective grid. From there, we'll move on to two-point and three-point. These three ways of thinking about perspective are, I think, the most common applications of this fundamental in any image, and they'll be able to take you very far in your average illustration. There is, of course, way more that goes into this fundamental. We won't even be going into 4 and 5-point perspective. That'd be a more advanced lesson. But these basic tips should be a really good way of dipping your toes in the water before you go off to learn more. So I'll take the process of creating an image in one-point perspective step by step with you so it'll be easier to follow along. First off, we will want to establish a horizon line. As we discussed earlier, this can be on or off of the image, but since this is just a basic perspective layout and we aren't really establishing a full frame, let's just make a small mock-up of this on a piece of paper or on a large Photoshop file. Once the horizon line has been established, we can create our vanishing point. For each type of perspective, 2-point, 3-point, 4-point, etc., they will have that many vanishing points. So for 1-point perspective, we will just need to establish the single vanishing point. These main vanishing points will always line up along the horizon line. But let's do a simple one in the center of the horizon line for this example. This point is where all lines of depth will converge. Any line that would be receding in space will lead to that exact point. Any horizontal or vertical line will create a 90-degree angle with one another and be perfectly vertical or perfectly horizontal, since objects in this perspective will only follow along the center vanishing point or the horizon line. This is because there is no vanishing point leading upwards or downwards for any vertical lines to recede into space to, and there's no vanishing point to the left or right of the center vanishing point for any horizontal lines to converge on. This isn't how we actually perceive the world. Of course, this is kind of a simplified version of how we can perceive 3D forms. It's always important to remember that perspective isn't a science, it's a set of tricks that we can use to kind of give the illusion of depth and space. In the end, we're still just looking at a flat, two-dimensional plane. So with this current layout of a horizon line and a center vanishing point, we can draw up the front corners of any given box, then connect each corner to the vanishing point near the center. If you're using Photoshop, a good tip is to hold Shift and tap once with your brush. It's going to create a straight line from wherever your last brush stroke was. Either that or use the line tool, right-click, and click Stroke. Remove Simulate Pressure and make sure the setting is set to Brush. This will do a straight line brush stroke using whatever your current brush settings are, so make sure it's a small brush. From here, we have the majority of our shape made. We just need to close off the back portion of our box with a horizontal line at the top. Once we've closed it off, we can base the unseen corners off of the newly created corners by intersecting straight vertical lines with the lines that are converging on the vanishing point. Finally, this leaves us just one last line to close off the entirety of the shape. With this basic perspective layout, you should be able to follow along the lines established by your vanishing point and draw up a decent scene just filled with boxes. And eventually other things, hopefully. But for now, you can make some pretty dope boxes. However, you should be able to make a fairly convincing series of box shapes within a contained 3D scene. I suggest playing around with this perspective and experimenting with new placements of vanishing points before continuing on in the video. Just take some time to draw up your own horizon line, vanishing point, etc. Play around with creating boxes above and below the horizon line and observe how the shape can be seen from below or above. Then do the same, but with shapes to the left of the vanishing point and to the right of it. Try to place multiple shapes in front of one another and practice creating convincing T-intersections to enhance the foreshortening in the image. This will all be a continual occurrence within any perspective that you lay out, no matter how many vanishing points. So get your practice in while you can. 2-point perspective. 1-point perspective is pretty simple. Everything established in 1-point perspective only needs the knowledge of where the lines receding in space should be placed. Other than that, the vertical and horizontal lines are taken care of. However, in 2-point perspective, things start to change a little bit. Let's start with another step-by-step process, and then we can discuss the end result once it's completed. Like the previous step, we'll start with the horizon line. From there, let's jot down some locations for where we want our left and right vanishing points to be. We won't worry about center vanishing points in 2-point perspective yet. They will become important later on, but for now, let's just make sure you understand how to create objects using multiple vanishing points. Try to keep the left and right vanishing points separated from one another a decent amount, at least for this example. After all, we're trying to make basic boxes, and if the two vanishing points that each side of the box are angled towards are close to one another, then you'll have a pretty wonky looking box. It'll look more like a strange, thin, diamond-shaped box, so let's keep them separate for now. There are ways of making sure that your box is going to be perfectly box-shaped, or at least have an exact right angle to the corner, but that involves the cone of vision and degrees, and like I said, we're keeping things simple. Once you have your left vanishing point and right vanishing point in place, this will give you the option to converge two lines that lead to these separate points and create the front corner of your box. To close the base of your box off, you will draw another line from each vanishing point that will converge with the opposite vanishing point line. So draw one line that intersects with the line leading to the left vanishing point and a line that intersects with the line leading to the right vanishing point. This will give you the base of your box. From here, similar to 1-point perspective, all vertical lines are parallel to one another and can be drawn straight, and at whatever height you choose. So draw a line upwards from that initial front corner you established. Once you've found the height that you wish your box to be at, connect the top of the line to both the left and the right vanishing points. Then create vertical lines from the bottom left and right corners of your box that connect to the previously drawn lines. Finally, connect those intersected points towards their respective vanishing points, and for good measure, maybe create a vertical line in the back so you can visualize the full form in 3D space. And that's it. You've drawn a box in 2-point perspective. It might not be a perfect box, but it's certainly a shape, and it's in that perspective. Now, I recommend you take this knowledge and, like with 1-point perspective, start playing around with it. Draw a sea of boxes. Make note of how the box can change shape and possibly even warp under certain circumstances. 3-point perspective. All right, 3-point perspective is one of the last most commonly used perspectives we're going to discuss. So we've now drawn a layout that has a single point of depth and 2 points of depth. I'm assuming you can pick up how 3-point perspective is probably going to go by now. We will be adding a 3rd point of depth. Previously, all of our vanishing points have been in line with the horizon line. However, 3-point is different. 3-point creates depth vertically, not horizontally. Therefore, it won't originate from the horizon line. We need to imagine a different type of a horizon line, or if not a horizon line, then at least a different type of a vanishing point. one that leads all vertical lines to the same point. This can lead vertical lines to a point above us or below us. Imagine looking upwards at a tall skyscraper or down at a city from atop the same tall building. These 2 points of view are when 3-point perspective are most prevalent. So let's just start the process. I'm going to do another step-by-step of 2 perspective layouts. One with a lower vanishing point of a bird's eye view and one with a higher vanishing point of a worm's eye view. All right, so to start this, like always, let's draw that horizon line. Let's do it. Bet you can't guess what the next step is. I bet you didn't guess that it's to do some vanishing points. That's right. Gotta mark some vanishing points. So let's put a left vanishing point and let's put a right vanishing point. Anyway, so after you put the left and right vanishing points on there, remembering to keep them fairly separate because we don't want any weird warped boxes. From here, we will construct the base of this box the same way that we did in 2-point perspective, since at this point, nothing is changing the horizontal relationship of this object. So intersect 2 lines wherever you feel comfortable to create the first corner of your box. Then create the back lines. From here, we can begin thinking about the vertical relationship of the object. For this example, let's do the bird's eye view. Place a new point a significant space below the horizon line, preferably below your already established square. This method works best when the majority of your structures are placed below the horizon line. With that bottom point you've now created, create an array of lines outward that converge on that point. These will act as your guidelines for depth. This point is essentially its own horizon line. Anything closer to the point in 3D space would become smaller and smaller. From this step, we can now follow the established guidelines and mark the cutoff point of the depth of the object we started. From the base of the object, we can then connect the point to our left and right vanishing points in order to create our left and right sides of our box. Connect the top of the square to the newly created bottom lines by following along the 3rd vanishing point guidelines, and this will close off the visible areas of the box. Repeat the same process for the other unseen sides of the box. And you've now created a box from a bird's eye view. Oh my god. So from here, try to experiment and add multiple boxes of varying sizes. Even have some break through the horizon line so you can get an idea of the warped appearance that you can achieve. I don't want you to think that you can't still have your objects in perspective break through the horizon line in this instance. In fact, most of the time with worm's eye view, you will still have to have some of the object break through the horizon line. Just know that it can cause some distortion or possible undesired looks when doing so. But let's talk about that one now, the worm's eye view. Let's start how we started the previous one. Try pausing the video, actually, and starting it yourself without my guidance, just to really make sure that you have it. The horizon line, the left vanishing point, and the right vanishing point. From here, instead of the 3rd vanishing point being placed lower, we'll place it above the horizon line. Try to place it at a good distance above it, though. A lot of the times with this type of perspective, you won't be able to include these vanishing points on the actual canvas. In Photoshop, there are tools to help with this, like the line tool, shape tool, etc. But traditionally, you can always try to wing it. These vanishing points are a little more forgiving than the left and right vanishing points. Usually, my personal approach to winging the 3rd vanishing point, whether it's upper or lower, is creating a center line that represents the very center that would lead up the point. From there, you can space out additional lines that angle towards that off-canvas vanishing point. But the further from the center line they are, the more dramatic of an angle the whole line is. This obviously isn't the most precise way of creating or following a 3rd vanishing point, but as long as each line further from the center is at an increasingly larger angle, it should give the illusion of that upward convergence. Anyway, so you have your 3rd point now. Create those guidelines to follow so that we can create our box. Establish that front corner of your box, whether it's below or above the horizon line, whatever you feel like playing around with. Close off the back of the box by connecting the left and right vanishing points to the opposing lines, and then, like the bird's eye view, draw up the vertical center line by following the guidelines to wherever you would like the height of your object to be. From the peak of its height, connect that point to the left and right vanishing points. Then connect the left and right corners of the base to the height by following the vertical guide. Then repeat the same process for the hidden edges and corners. As always, please experiment from here. create multiple boxes, create a whole new perspective grid even, one with wildly different proportions. See what works and what clearly doesn't work. Next up, we're going to be going over some general tips and tricks for perspectives that is going to make your life a whole lot easier when you decide to start making castles instead of boxes. Other than perspective grids and general terminology, there are other things that perspective can be used for. It's helpful to know how to place things within a perspective grid, but it's also really helpful to know how to place things at the same height in an image, but from different distances, or being able to mirror objects in an image. So we're going to be going over some of these useful tricks. Dividing evenly. This one is probably the one I use most, and I encourage everyone to start implementing it into their own work. It's almost like building a block of what the rest of the tips and tricks are kind of found upon. Most of the time, this technique will need to be used in order to make some sort of careful measurement and perspective. So let's take this step by step. Start by drawing a square or a rectangle. Any kind of general box should work. From here, draw 2 diagonal lines from one corner to the other on both sides. You should kind of have an X shape within your square now. From here, you've essentially found the center of your shape. Where those 2 lines intersect is the center. Now that the center is found, all you have to do is draw a horizontal line and a vertical line through the center. You now have a shape evenly divided into 4 equal sections. The same process can be repeated infinitely to divide. Try the same process, but now within one of the 4 newly created shapes. You should have 3 large squares and 4 small squares, but all within that original square you created. This technique is essential to measuring and dividing shapes within perspective. It can even be repeated on shapes that are in perspective. Take this angled square, for instance. Just a flat plane, essentially, but it's clearly receding into space towards a vanishing point. Now, let's repeat the same process from before. Draw the diagonals to create that X shape and find the center point. Once the center is found, draw a horizontal and a vertical line. However, this time, remember to follow the rules of our perspective grid. If it's in 2-point perspective, the vertical line will be straight, but the horizontal line will need to also angle towards the vanishing point that the top and bottom of the plane are angled towards. If it's within 3-point perspective, both the vertical and the horizontal dividing lines will need to angle towards their respective vanishing points, creating multiple objects of the same height. Some of you may not necessarily need perspective knowledge for any sort of architectural drawings, but even your average character artist person will someday have to paint a scene with 2 people in it. One close and maybe one far away. And boy, have I seen a lot of messed up perspective from people that don't consider their character's height in relation to one another. And it's real sad because it's such an easy fix, like as long as you plan accordingly. Let's say you have a character in the foreground of your image, and let's even start with just a simple 1-point perspective layout. If you were to include a second character further in the distance, even only 10 feet away, you'll still want to measure that out. So let's draw a line from the top of your foreground character and connect it to the vanishing point. Then do the same for the bottom of your character. This is now a guideline for your character's height, which leads all the way to the horizon line. Meaning any character or object that goes from the bottom line to the top line will be the same exact height as your foreground character. This same process is repeatable in all perspectives. All right, so let's try the same process, but this time in 2-point perspective. We'll start with a foreground character, this time a little bit more boxy than the previous one since we're in 2-point perspective. And let's draw a line from the top of the character to the appropriate vanishing point, and the same for the bottom of the character. These are your guides, just like before, so let's draw another character within this height range. And maybe, since we're in 2-point perspective now, we will add a third character, but this time not within the same line. So let's draw a new line from the top of the second character, but to the other vanishing point. Same with the bottom of the character. Now we created a whole new height guide that follows a different path, but is still an accurate depiction of the foreground character's height. See, it's really easy. Like if you just take a second in the early stages of your drawing to make sure your characters are measured correctly in relation to the horizon line, you will have a perfectly measured out scene, and it's not that difficult. Really just make sure that your horizon line is accurate and you're good. Duplicating. Duplicating is very useful for repeated patterns and scenes. Whether it's simple checkerboards or repeated pillars in an environment, duplicating will allow you to take a plane or an object and multiply it throughout any given area. For this first demonstration, let's start with just a basic plane. Draw a flat rectangle that doesn't exist within any given perspective. From here, we do the same X technique we did in order to divide a rectangle earlier in the video. This will allow us to find the center of the shapes and allow us to create a cross section with a vertical line and a horizontal line. Now, decide which side of the shape you would like to expand on, the top, bottom, left, or right. For this demo, I'm going to expand out to the right and create a duplicate of this rectangle just to the side of itself. In order to do this, we need to be able to find the exact width of the rectangle. We already have the height given to us since we can just expand the horizontal lines outwards, but we need to know how far out the rectangle goes in order to have it match perfectly. And yes, you could just use a ruler and measure, but come on, man, don't be a loser. Just use this weird magic trick thing. Draw a diagonal line starting from the top left of the rectangle downwards and have it intersect with the center of the right wall of the rectangle. This is going to require a steady hand or just Photoshop line tool if you're working digitally, but be patient and you'll get there. The diagonal line should look something like this in the end. Where the diagonal meets the extended bottom of the original rectangle is where the right wall of the newly duplicated rectangle will begin. So just draw a vertical line upwards to connect to the extended top of the original rectangle, and boom, you've got a duplicated shape. This technique can be used the same exact way, but for an object in perspective. Let's take this box within 2-point perspective. All we need to do is find the center of one side of the box by drawing an X, then finding the center of each wall or edge of the plane by drawing a line from the center of the X to the respective vanishing point. Now repeat the process before of drawing a diagonal line that goes from the top left corner of the plane through the center of the right wall and out towards the base height of the object. The base and the top of the object, of course, are just extensions of the given base and height of the original object. Now close off the wall on the right, and you've successfully duplicated a plane in perspective. From here, the rest of the perspective grid should give you enough landmarks to complete the box fully. Now let's say you wanted to extend upwards and create a tower of same-sized boxes. That's easy. With your new box, establish the X shape in order to find the center of each wall or edge, like how we started the last process. But from there, draw a diagonal line from either the bottom left or bottom right corner of the box that intersects with the center of the top edge of the plane. Extend the vertical sides of the box upwards in order to find where the diagonal intersects. From there, draw a line from the connected corner to the respective vanishing point. Once this plane is created, like before, use the landmarks of your perspective grid to create the rest of the box. This process is easily repeatable and can be very useful in a whole variety of images. Mirroring planes. The next process I want to show is how to mirror or duplicate objects that aren't necessarily directly next to each other. For this technique, though, you can use the same principles in order to do things like mirroring an object in perspective that might be equal or mirrored on both sides. Cars are a great example of this. Let's start with a flat plane like the previous techniques, and then we're going to move into an example developed in perspective. So let's create a flat plane, then add a line indicating where the center point or mirror would be. Now the goal is to have the object translate to the opposite side of the mirror and keep it at the same distance as the original plane currently is set at. So let's start with that good old X shape within the plane. From here, develop the center point on the right side of the plane. Now extend that line leading from the center of the plane through the center of the right side and into the mirror. This is the center point of the mirror. Now draw a diagonal from the top right corner of the plane through the center of the mirror and out through the other end. Extend the bottom side of the plane until it connects with this new diagonal, and boom, there's your bottom left corner of the mirrored plane. Now we need to develop the right side of the mirrored plane. Repeat the same process as before, only this time draw a diagonal from the left top or bottom corners of the original plane. Remember, it has to pass through the center point of the mirror. Once it meets with the extended top or bottom of the plane, you will have found your first right corner. From there, you should be able to develop the full right side. That's generally how you mirror an object. You'll need to know where the mirrored point would be. Usually, it's the center line of the object you're attempting to mirror. So let's try and mirror a plane, but this time within 2-point perspective. So let's develop an implied 2-point perspective grid, and let's just smack a plane on that. Then let's throw in a mirror. To go along with the idea that it's more of a center divide of an object and less like an actual physical mirror, we're going to just give it like a dashed line look. Remember, for consistency, to also have your mirror follow the same perspective grid you've drawn out for the plane. Now, like always, develop the X within the plane we've created and create the center points of each edge of the plane. Extend the center point of the edge that is parallel with the mirror towards the vanishing point that would create a perpendicular line. Where the line meets the bottom edge of the mirror is the center of the bottom edge of the mirror, which we will be using to follow through with like the previous example and find our mirrored plane measurements. So just like the last example, draw a diagonal line going from one of the corners closest to the mirror through the center of the bottom edge of the mirror until it intersects with the extended edges of the original plane. Remember, the extended edges have to converge on the respective vanishing point though, since this is 2-point perspective. As a side note, you can start with whichever corner you'd like when mirroring the plane. You'll still receive the same measurement results. All it is locating where the lines intersect and taking that information to then create the rest of the plane. So repeat the process from before, taking those diagonal lines and bringing them on through the center of the bottom edge of the mirror, and you should have all of the corners of your mirrored plane very easily. From here, you should be able to create the rest of your shape. Mirroring curves. The final technique that I'm going to go over is how to mirror those pesky curved objects. Curves are incredibly annoying in perspective, and I'm only going to be skimming the surface as far as techniques that can be done to achieve a somewhat accurate curve in perspective go. When you start getting into how to develop a perfect circle in perspective, that's when things really start ramping up in difficulty. But I don't want to overwhelm people who are just dipping their toes into the perspective waters, so we're going to keep things simple for now. So this is a technique that can be used to mirror a curved pattern that you've developed. It's great for things like arches, doorways, unique curved patterns in architecture, or on a flat plane of some sort, whatever. Essentially, what we will be doing is developing a series of landmark points that, when put together, will create a nice guide for us to draw our line through. You'll need a steady hand, and you're gonna need to accurately place landmarks in order for this to work, but I believe in you. This technique, like most, will start with a plane. Create a plane with a basic curve design, like a basic archway, but only half of one. From here, we will be duplicating and mirroring it so it will look perfectly balanced on both sides. Since we have this flat plane though, we can duplicate the plane for now. This will allow us to find our height and width of the curve easily and help us when we need to mirror our landmark points. So there are a few ways to develop landmark points, and I recommend utilizing each and every one in order to give yourself a more accurate guide to draw your curve. I'd feel dishonest though if I didn't mention that all of the techniques I'll be showing here are from Scott Robertson's How to Draw book. It's a great source and goes way further into perspective than I'm going to go into here, so I encourage all of you to check it out. Just be warned, it is a pretty heavy book. All right, technique 1. Take the center point between the two mirrored planes and draw a diagonal from the center to the top left and top right corners of the two planes. Should make kind of a V shape. Now, the left diagonal line should intersect with the curve you've drawn at some point. Draw a horizontal line from that intersection all the way through to the mirrored plane. Where that horizontal line intersects with the right plane's diagonal line is where your first landmark point will be. This is one point that absolutely falls along where your curve design would be if it were mirrored. Technique 2. Draw a horizontal line through the center point of both of the mirrored planes. Then draw a diagonal line leading from the center of the left edge and right edge of each plane towards the bottom center edge of the two planes together. There ideally should be a point where the diagonal line will intersect with the curve you've created. Like before, draw a horizontal line through that intersection to the opposite plane. Where that horizontal connects with the mirrored plane's diagonal line will be another landmark point. Sometimes there won't be a good intersection when doing this technique. It's alright, just stick to the other techniques discussed here, and you should have enough points to go off of. Technique 3. This one is probably the most efficient as far as needing a very precise landmark point. Maybe you have a complex curve design that has some abrupt changes in direction. This will allow you to find the exact points you'll need to mirror for those. Find a specific point in your curve that you'd like to mirror and mark it. Draw a diagonal line from the bottom center edge of the two planes through the point you've marked and onto the outer edge of the respective plane. Draw a horizontal line from the intersection between the diagonal and the plane, as well as the diagonal and the desired landmark point. Now, draw a diagonal from the top horizontal line where it intersects with the mirrored plane to the bottom center edge of the two planes. Where this line intersects with the bottom horizontal line is where your mirrored landmark point will be. You can repeat this process multiple times to get the desired points for your curve. Technique 4. This is the last technique for developing a landmark point for your mirrored curve, and it's another one that you can repeat over and over again in order to get a specific mirrored point. So feel free to repeat either technique 3 or 4 when wanting to develop these points. Whichever one you prefer, you should still get the same results. Choose a specific point on your curve design. That is now going to become the bottom left corner of a rectangle. Draw a vertical and horizontal line from the desired point to create a rectangle. Then use the duplication method to find the location of the opposite corner. From here, you should have at least 4 landmark points for you to then take your nice steady hand and draw a smooth curve through them. It's going to take practice doing this, but being able to create a smooth curve based off of given points will be a great skill to have when needing to work this way traditionally, and it will build up your line confidence like nobody's business. Studying techniques. Man, lots of stuff we went over. Okay. Ugh. I hope it wasn't too much to keep in mind for anyone who is fresh to this stuff. Perspective can get pretty overwhelming with all the measurements, and it can just completely fall apart just from one small inaccuracy. So it can be a little intimidating to new artists, but with enough practice and consideration, I think everyone can improve at this. I do say consideration because not a lot of people take the time to really consider the perspective of their image, and I think it's just because it's something that you can kind of fudge a lot of the time, but I do think the small nuances and perspective is what really gets people. We talked about big picture perspective, large boxes and forms leading to horizon lines, but we didn't go over how if you're drawing a person doing some sort of an action, that person is just a giant walking box made of 100 other boxes, all with their own vanishing points that coexist within your developed perspective grid. So just try to consider the big picture stuff next time you work on an image, and it's going to make a huge difference. As for actual exercises, though, there are a couple things that helped me out early on when I was first dipping my own toes into the subject. I have to give credit to Isra Carrion. I'm sorry if I butcher your name, dude. For these exercises, he had a mentorship on the old Crimson Daggers art forums that I followed along with years ago, and it helped immensely, so thank you so much, Isra. The first exercise I'd recommend is to take photos of architecture. Not take actual your own photos, just go to Google. Keep it simple at first. Start with just like a basic boxy house or apartment building, not a full cityscape. Once you have that picture, try to locate the horizon line as well as the vanishing points. It really gets you thinking about perspective in a very realistic way and can make it all feel real and tangible in a way that maybe drawing just basic boxes on like a blank white canvas can't quite get. Most photos that you're going to find online will probably fall under the 2 or the 3-point perspective grid, so try to find what perspective particular photos are and discover the vanishing points of each building. Eventually, you can work your way up to things like cityscapes where you'll find buildings that don't all converge on the same vanishing points. The second exercise is to start taking the time to develop your own buildings in perspective. Buildings are great to start with even if you aren't interested in architectural design because they're just generally boxy and they fit within the vanishing points much easier than a more organic object or a human. So start with basic 1-point perspective and then move on to 2-point and finally develop 3-point. In Isra's mentorship that I had mentioned previously, he had given some great assignments that made working on perspective-heavy images actually kind of fun, and again, it made it feel more tangible and less like you were wasting your time just drawing boxes. One assignment was to create your bedroom or office within 1-point perspective. Think about things like your bed, desk, dresser. How are those things placed in your room, and recreate it all with very basic shapes. Then, if you want, you could do some illustrative kind of finishing touches on it once it's placed in perspective. Once you've created your own room, try to find a photo online or maybe like a hotel room or someone else's room and do the same thing. It helps to Google hotel rooms since a lot of them have nice shots that are practically in 1-point perspective already. Another study to try and do to help develop your 2-point perspective skills would be to find a photo of a particular building and recreate that building, but now using your own custom 2-point perspective grid. Even if that photo of the building is already in 2-point perspective, try creating your own grid first and then recreating the building based off of your measurements, not off the photo. The final study that you can try, and one that I personally loved because it's just a really great foundation to what could act as a portfolio piece if you're interested in this type of work, was to create a shot of a level of a video game. It helps if you can create a top-down view, since this is usually most helpful when actually developing levels in games, but it doesn't need to be. This allows you to think of small things like platforms and traps, slants and hills, practical things that would be within a game world, and you place them in perspective. I think practicing some of these exercises, even starting from my first suggestions to this last one in order, will give you really, really good practice with perspective, and it will help you visualize a lot of the information I've gone over today. Add in practice with those additional tips and tricks at the end, like mirroring objects or creating curves, and you'll have a really good foundation to the beginning of your perspective training. All right, well, that's all I got for you, really. I hope I gave you enough information to start you off on learning perspective, but not so much information that you feel completely lost and overwhelmed by everything in front of you. I think if you take the assignments that I laid out one at a time, start slow and build up, you'll do just fine. As always, thank you so much for purchasing my tutorials. My last one will be all about composition, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you again for all the support on these. I really appreciate it.